Hello everybody, it's Frank Norris here, introducing the Frank and Stan chat number 11, and we never thought we were going to get past number 1, but we've got to number 11, and it's good morning from Stan.
Morning.
There he is in his cricket pavilion, summer house, and we have a guest this week, and it's the colleague in the bottom of the screen. Hello Mike.
Hi.
Hi, so this is Mike Cladingbowl. Do you want to introduce yourself, Mike? Because people probably know who we are.
I'm Mike Cladingbowl. I've never met Stan before this morning, at least I don't think so, but I've known Frank for a number of years now. We worked together, I think, first of all, when I first joined Ofsted as an HMI. We went on an adventure somewhere in the wilds of the Lake District, but perhaps more of that a bit later on. So I've been a secondary school teacher for most of my career, apart from a stint at Ofsted. But I'm back working in a multi-academy trust at the moment.
Yes, where is that? That's in.
So that's based in Knutsford. There's also a school in Crewe, and we're looking to merge with another multi-academy trust actually. So that's something that's about to happen in the next few days, the next couple of weeks. So schools in Cheshire and also one in Staffordshire.
Oh, fantastic! Right. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to be positive today. We try and have this as a rule that we're going to be upbeat. We're not going to slag anybody off, and we're actually, I think, Mike, you're facing stuff that Stan and I, as head teachers, never faced. So all this COVID malarkey is stuff that you're having to deal with. We're in awe of what's being achieved by schools and senior leaders, particularly dealing with all this. So we're respectful of that. And I think also we have Stan's word, which is we're going to try and be
kind. We try to be to each other.
And actually, most people
kind back.
Yeah, most people are kind in terms of what we're trying to achieve here. And we do have a number of regular viewers, so we're grateful for them commenting and telling us, where we've gone wrong, but also where we've gone right in their view. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is, has anything caught your eye this week, Stan?
Just a quick one, and it was a reminder, really. I was communicating with some schools and asking my colleagues the best way to get some information through, and they talked about how wonderful it is to get a letter on decent paper. And all the talk we've done over the last few weeks about doing everything by Zoom. So I ended up printing 60 odd letters, writing them, printing them, etc. But it made me remember that some training I did a long time ago on leadership, where they said that personal touch, that personal thank you note. And I remember rubbishing it at the time and thinking, what a waste of space that is. And then that evening, getting something out of my bedside cabinet and finding some cards that people had sent me saying, well done, or thank you, or I appreciated it. And the fact that I'd kept them. And so I started doing that, and I was amazed at the results. Something as simple as a thank you card with an individual thing. So paper letters maybe will make a comeback, a personal approach.
Yeah, I think I should say this will be my thought for the day, I suppose, or what's called my, because you've triggered it just there, was when I used to work in the co-op, well, I still do work for the co-op, but actually working more sort of on a day-to-day basis, they have a very simple thank you card system whereby you can either post it to a colleague or you can pop it up on the wall somewhere in the office. And a lot of people tweet those. It's not about the big pay rise they got or the promotion. It's about the surprise card that they got, acknowledging the work that they've done. So, that's triggered it for me. Mike, anything caught your eye this week? Go on, Stan, you've got something to say.
I was just going to say, the difficulty is it went, because we did it in Lancashire and it got caught on, but it became corporate and it lost all its impact because it was very easy to click something and send it to your workforce as opposed to get something, handwrite it and give it. So to the corporate level would be my excuse. My thought.
Mike, you all right this week?
Well, I was in the office yesterday, and I was having a bit of a clear out, as you do from time to time, and I was filling up, I think, the third sack of confidential waste when it struck me how things that seem so important at the time that you can't possibly let them go end up being completely irrelevant. And in the middle of, we might come on to talk about some of this, but in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, and seeing the extraordinary kind of efforts and energy and imagination that people are bringing to solving sometimes quite complex and knotty problems, you know, that have got a moral aspects to them, as well as logistical aspects. It just struck me that that we often in our jobs and in our lives spend far too much time sweating the unimportant stuff. Anyway, we're all consigned to the bin now, so that's good.
No, that's a really good point, because I think we've covered that previously in some of these, because it's all around, you know, the core function of education, isn't it? And actually there are at various times priorities overtake each other. And actually there are fundamental safeguarding and care priorities which are at the heart of good education, a good society. And it's, in some respects, COVID has brought all that to the, you know, because actually those schools that have really stepped up are the ones that really have got that in their DNA. You know, that's their fundamental purpose, and they're able to step into that to sort of take leadership within the community. So yeah, it's been a fascinating period. I'm just so pleased that I wasn't a head teacher during it, I have to say. Have you learnt something about yourself though, Mike, in time? I
mean, funnily enough, I was talking to one of my trustees about this. We were reflecting on some of the fantastic things that people have been doing and some of the fantastic qualities that people have been showing. And as I was talking to him, I was reflecting on my own kind of feelings and my own approaches throughout. And I'm ashamed to say that that I, in a perverse kind of way, quite enjoyed it. And I not obviously enjoyed the horror, not enjoyed the terrible tragedy, not enjoyed the difficulties that it's faced, not enjoyed the fact that children are unable to be in school, and with all of the difficult and attendant difficulties that's brought with it, and all the pressures on families and all of that sort of stuff. But I quite like a crisis, and I find that I often respond better in those circumstances than I do in the kind of the daily grind, if I'm really honest, Frank. So it's something that I think I've probably always known about myself, but it struck me quite forcibly, really, over these last few.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because I think we've found that in terms of, well, I think I've noticed that in the way that schools have responded to the crisis, that there are some leaders who are able to step up, you know, and show that sort of, who basically want to really lead and actually want the sort of the challenge of things being uncertain, you know, whereas there are others who are actually more comfortable in a sort of like a more methodical type of approach, where perhaps things are well established or are becoming well established, and actually sort of work well within that sort of structure. But I think I'm a bit like you. I think there's a little buzz that comes from it, and you think, oh, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to, I might not achieve this. This might fail. You know, I mean, I think there's a little bit of cut and thrust on that. What about you, Stan?
I think early on in one of these, when we first talked about it, I said, you know, actually, despite everything, I think I would like to be a head teacher during this, you know, with all those caveats about not wanting all the things that are happening, but the idea that you're suddenly thrust upon to make big decisions and make them quickly and make them taking everybody with you, I think is, like both of you said, it's part of my psyche, and it would be something that would be enjoyable to some extent, enjoyable in terms of testing your leadership.
One of the things that's been, sorry, Frank, I beg your pardon.
No, go on, Mike, you carry on.
Well, only one of the things that I've been thinking about is this business about creating certainty, and I think what it felt like early on was that everything was suddenly uncertain. Nobody really knew what was going on. The news was unfolding day by day, and events were really policy was following events sometimes. So there was some kind of quite interesting things going on in that space too. But what it did mean was that what we had to do, I think, as school leaders, is to try to create that island of certainty amongst a sea of confusion for staff, for parents, for children, for our communities. And that was a really important thing, I think, to do. And having done that, I think you're able to start developing trust in what you were suggesting and trust in what you were advising. And then from then on, I think it quite rapidly got to a point whereby heads, certainly that I work with, found themselves on dry land again, and were able to step up and then in turn lead their own schools through. So it's been quite an interesting experience, and one that I've been reflecting on a little bit. And one of the heads and I might try and write a little chapter in a book that's coming out on it. So if that ever happens, I'll send you both a copy.
I think
it's interesting, Mike, that a colleague of mine who works with a company called Mindflick, who are all about the psychology, initially in sport, but now in everything, called me this week to say, is it worth doing a bit of research around which schools have managed to rise above the crisis, if you like, and provide whatever they have done, and which schools haven't, and what's the difference in the psychology of those leaders? I mean, I do think from your description, Frank, there, you were almost separating leadership from management, and people who are more comfortable in a managing role rather than a leadership role.
Yeah.
Although my belief is leaders and managers are the same people, but there's a management role and there's a leadership role. And I think in a crisis, leadership develops, management almost goes to the side. Management follows it. Once leadership's got to the firm ground, then how we manage it then becomes part two.
Yeah, I think it's this idea. I mean, it gets us neatly, doesn't it? Only we're running out of time, onto sort of the Ofsted experiences, which we've all got in various different forms. Actually, I know that one of the great things around my work as a new HMI at the turn of the century was actually having time to talk to other HMI in a duty desk in London for a week. And we talked about what the difference between leadership and management was. And we had time to mull over some of those sort of fundamental issues, which to be honest, I've never really thought about, even though I may have inspected, and I was aware what the definition of those, in terms of Ofsted, what the definition of those sort of areas were. But actually, a chance to think more deeply about it.
It's an interesting fact, Frank. The word leadership isn't in the first framework we used.
Really? That was
it is, but it only applies to governors.
I have to say, I mean, my experience as an HMI was a joyous one. I have to say I gained an awful lot. And the year I had as a seconded head teacher in the mid-90s with you, Stan, made me look much more closely at what outcomes were being achieved, not just in terms of academic outcomes, but more broadly, what I suppose it gave me a chance to consider what the purpose of a good school, or what a good school looks like, and what goes into that. So I think that I've gained an awful lot, which I still use today. I don't know if that's similar to you, Mike.
Oh yeah, I mean, without any doubt at all. I mean, I've been lucky enough to have had some fantastic jobs and worked with some fantastic people. As a teacher, as an HMI, as a head, don't regret any of it, not for one minute. I think that the thing that struck me most when I became an HMI in 2002, I think it was, after being a secondary school head teacher in Crewe, was that there was there was suddenly I was with a band of people who were often like-minded, and who provided the most extraordinary professional support. And in those days, I joined the School Improvement Division, otherwise known as SID. You'll remember, Frank.
I was in squad.
You were in squad, that's right. So the Quality Assurance Division, wasn't it?
It was.
There were only about 40 or so of us nationally. And what we did was that we worked in the special measures schools in England and in the schools in challenging circumstances. And we used to do two-day inspections a week, and then have a day at home writing up whatever we'd be leading on, working with usually 2, 3, 4 HMI in schools, depending on the size of the school and if it was primary or secondary and so on. And I learnt more, I think, which probably in 6 months than I did in 6 years as a head. It probably says an awful lot about what a terrible head I was, but it was extraordinary. And I think people forget too, you know, how many schools at that time were still really struggling. You know, all those apocryphal stories, you know, people swinging from the chandeliers and, you know, classes rampaging down the corridor because the supply teacher hadn't been given a key to the class and so didn't know what to do. Children nipping out of the back exit in a classroom to have a crafty fag midway through a lesson and nobody turning a blind eye, you know, and so on and so forth. But there were some schools that really did struggle, really did struggle, and schools are so much better now. There's no question in my mind. There always have been fantastic schools, of course, but some have really struggled. Some still do, of course, often because of the social disadvantage that their communities face, I think. But schools are much better, and I certainly enjoyed my times in HMI. I thought it was a fabulous experience working with some fabulous people, and we were made very welcome, Frank. I think.
I really felt. I mean, I think you felt this as well, Stan, when we had that year together, that we had, in effect, entered into a sort of secret garden of brilliance. You know, I really the quality of the colleagues, many of whom have actually, Mike, as you know, had never really inspected a school in their lives. You know, I mean, that was one of the challenges I was given, is to find a way of making. I remember David Bell saying, well, they're called Her Majesty's Inspectors of Schools, but how many of them have actually inspected a school? You know, was an interesting question. I mean, obviously SID did, you know, and Squad did a little bit, but actually a lot of HMIs were inspectors and whatever, and were very sort of focused in on that. So I think for me, I entered that secret garden and really found it amazing. Was that the same for you, Stan?
Yeah, there's so much we learned in that 12 months. Part of it was the mystique of HMIs suddenly being able to make judgments from what appeared to be very scant evidence that we've been struggling with, and their certainty and their confidence that those were right, and that took some time, I think, for us to get hold of that, and then the drive for outcomes, which I have to say, and I have to say this in reference to my reception teacher, I had to be deprogrammed when I went back into school, because I went with this vision that we were all about learning. We weren't about a social enterprise. I got onto history and went for all the staff, saying these children must be able to distinguish between real people and people who are stories and myths. And I had a whole staff meeting about it. Came out, felt great. And my reception teacher, one of the best teachers I've ever worked with, came into my office and quietly said, "What do you want me to do about the tooth fairy?" Everything. It was like, wow, okay, you've just shown me the light side again. There's a compromise between the two, but yeah, the tooth fairy was the thing that made me just program.
The social conditioning piece is funny, though, isn't it? I remember, you know, after I've been doing the HMI work for a year or two, I find myself adopting a different kind of language, a different way of looking at the world. So you'd be in the supermarket aisle in Sainsbury's, and you'd be thinking, those courgettes look satisfactory. And
yeah. I mean, Mike, the work you and I did was around a lot of framework development, which was very, I have to say, probably some of the most challenging work, because obviously you really do get to the heart of, you need to understand what goodness feels like, in order to be able to draw out those elements within it. I mean, have you been able to, how has that prepared you then for the life you're now living, in terms of, because is it the same, or is it very different? Is it so specialist, framework development, or is it actually just another job?
I think in some ways, to be a good developer of an inspection framework, you need to be a bit of an all-rounder, actually. What you need to be able to do is to draw on the expertise of folk who are around you. And I think that's similar to the job I do now, Frank. I remember being involved in the, as you were, in the inspection of local services. So not just schools, but children's services more broadly. And then I did some work on social care inspections, working with other inspectorates for something that was around the inspection of locality, of place, with the Audit Commission as it was, the Healthcare Commission, and so on. And I led that really interesting piece of work for Ofsted. And as part of that, we developed, for example, the unannounced inspection of the front door in social services and so on, which was quite a new and radical thing at the time. But in all of that, I had to draw on those people who really, really knew what they were talking about in that area. So working with social care specialists and working with adult learning specialists and all the rest of it. So I think for me anyway, it actually helped being able to be reasonably flexible and to recognise that I actually probably didn't know enough, but what I could do was draw on the expertise and make good use of that, of others. And that thing about expertise is really important, reflecting back to what you said about HMI when we joined, Frank, and the people with whom we worked and you worked with, Stan, is that it always struck me that kind of anybody can go into a school and tell you if it's no good or not, what you need to do to improve it, though, is to be a specialist. And I think that's where HMI can come into their own and can really help schools improve, when they really know what they're talking about. Thinking about people like Jane Jones, and a colleague of ours who knew everything there was to know about mathematics teaching.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, I think we can ring off a number of colleagues who I've worked with, who are deeply impressive individuals, but actually have been around the block a few times as well. I mean that in a positive way. When you make about being an expert, doesn't come quickly, and actually I think when I was doing framework development, the range of schools, or the range of places that I'd visited, was crucially important in terms of drawing together a framework that would have be rolled out in a number of different settings. So looking at whether or not a nursery school could actually sit within the same framework as an all through primary, secondary school, and even a sixth form. Actually you do need to have that awareness of how this is going to be applied by inspectors. And I think you only get that by actually having visited a lot of nursery schools, a lot of secondary schools, a lot of free schools, a lot of prisons. So I think it's that bit of it that I think has made me what I am now. I think probably a bit more rounded individual. In terms of education.
One of the things that I was at a call yesterday with some primary heads talking about this new trust we're trying to build by bringing together two existing trusts, and talking to the primary heads on the Teams call. Other video conferencing facilities are available. I found myself being reminded and said to them that one of the things I learned from being an HMI and visiting, those hundreds and hundreds of schools over the years, at all different phases, was what it opened my eyes, frankly, to how fantastic primary schools are, and in lots of ways, how they do a much better job. I'm going to offend all of my secondary colleagues, I know, by saying this, but how in many, many ways they do a much, much better job than secondary schools, who even until quite recently, and some still do, for example, pay no attention to the Key Stage 2 assessments or to anything that the primary schools say about the children. They simply make them all sit a battery of other tests, and completely ludicrous. You just have to open an exercise book, don't you, for a Year 7 child to see how beautiful the handwriting is in the beginning of the year, and by the end of the year it's all gone horrible. And
I cannot understand why schools don't, secondary schools don't simply just ask primary schools to bring their books up with them.
Yeah,
there's this primary thing, they all go home to the parents, they get put in a loft. But actually the real value of them is the Year 7 teachers seeing what the work was like. Yeah. Stan, you were going to say something, I think, before we chipped in there.
I was just on that one. I was just going to say some of the work that I've seen recently in Stoke is bringing that in secondary teachers and maths are going into primary schools, and certainly the ones we spoke to were talking about completely revamping their Year 7 and Year 8 curriculum, because they were repeating stuff that had been done when the children were in Year 4 and Year 5, and also, which was really positive, spotting the gaps now and working on the gaps in Year 7. So, for example, a classic example is shape and measure, which isn't really tested now, so isn't really high on the curriculum in primaries, but was something that was missing when they started in secondary. But it's been that knowledge, I think, that's made the difference of actually going in. I did a similar project in Bury, and one of the secondary English teachers just said she was blown away with the quality of writing, not just the handwriting, the depth of everything. And she'd never realised that they worked like that. And as you say, Mike, when they came to us, it's a blank exercise book and you do whatever. So
you feel like you can do.
There's a lot to learn. And what I particularly like about that is they're not just calling it transition, they're calling it progress. It's continuing progress from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 4. They're not saying it's a transition thing for a fortnight when you go to high school. It's a long-term thing.
And Stan, that was one of the really key thing that I did learn, and I hope I've been able to bring that back with me, I think, into schools. And one of the first things that I did was exactly that, was to get some of the Year 7 books and take them down to the local primary schools and say, help me understand, is this good enough? And of course the answer was usually a resounding no. But I think it provided the basis for us to move forward, and certainly with one of the schools, the primary schools in the trust, it was a really great beginning, and I'd recommend that any new head does that. And it's sometimes it's such an obvious thing to do, isn't it? And I think that's the other thing that I learned from my time in Ofsted, Frank, that you talked before about how HMI seem to have the knack of getting to the heart of things. Well, I learned that, or in my view anyway, that I learned that really HMI do two things when they're in school. One is they walk very slowly while everybody else is running around, and that conveys all sorts of messages immediately. And the other thing they do is they ask the obvious question. And quite directly too, and coming back into schools after, you may have had this, Frank, and you may have had this, Stan, when you came back in, that coming back into schools after working in an untimetabled world that didn't have terms, I came back in and I couldn't for the life of me believe why, when I said, I've got a really good idea, let's do X or Y. And somebody would say to me, oh, yes, it's very interesting. Perhaps you can think about doing that next term or perhaps next year. I wanted to do it on Monday.
I think when we talk about going to schools as an inspector and realising how good schools were, there's also that bit that you have a bit of a chin drop, because you know your school and you know how good it is, and you assume all schools are roughly around that. And when you start to meet the ones that aren't, your chins drop a bit. And I think when I then became an advisor, What I then realised, which I hadn't before, is when I was an inspector, I was seeing schools at their very best or trying their very best. There was a level below that that really did make my chin drop. And I don't think that's the case now. I don't think anything, I don't see that now when I go in schools.
No, my chin drops now normally because they're so much better.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
I think one thing I would say as we come to a close is I think I was also taught as an HMI, when you ask a question, don't answer the question for the person that you've just asked it to, and give them time to answer. And if they can't answer, then that says a lot. So it's about ask the question and then step back and let the person speak.
I think, Frank, the statement that I can't remember which HMI said it to us, the best practice you'll ever see is what you would have done, and you have to undo that and look at the effectiveness of the practice that you watch it. Because the best lesson you would ever see would be the one that you would do. And that was a real thing to me, because I stopped then saying, well, I'd do this and I'd have done that, and started saying, well, what is happening? And you know, how are children learning? How is this being managed? And that to me was one of the biggest changes. I think.
The old preferred practice to
still happens.
Anyway, I think we're going to run out. So thank you, Mike. Thank you, Stan. It's been a really long discussion, I have to say, colleagues, than we normally have. So thank you very much, and we'll see everybody hopefully next week.
Yeah.